You'll be fine, Barb. A little apartment, your books. You never needed much. My husband of 35 years said that to me at Thanksgiving dinner, patting my hand like I was an old dog, while his mistress sat at our table, in my dead mother's chair, and our children stared at their plates in horror. And I asked him to pass the cranberry sauce. I want you to remember that detail, because everyone at that table thought I'd gone into shock. I hadn't. I was simply a woman who had waited 35 years to watch her husband do math wrong in public. And I knew something nobody in that dining room knew. The prenup Frank wrote to protect himself from me was about to cost him $4.2 million. But let me back up to 1991, because this story starts with a signature, and it ends with 1, 2. My name is Barbara. I'm 60 years old, a retired school librarian, 31 years of shushing teenagers and repairing paperback spines with tape, and for 35 of those years I was married to Frank Delaney, a mechanical engineer with a good pension, a straight part in his hair, and a relationship with money that I can only describe as devotional. Frank didn't spend money, Frank supervised it. He kept a ledger of household expenses in engineer's block print. He reused aluminum foil. And every October he'd do what he called the annual review, where he'd sit me down at the kitchen table and walk me through our position with laminated tabs. I want to be fair to him, because fairness is a habit I can't shake even now. Frank was not a monster in 1991. He was careful. And I mistook careful for safe, the way a lot of women my age were raised to. We met at a church potluck when I was 24. He was 26, already at the engineering firm he'd stay at for 4 decades, and he courted me the way he did everything, methodically, on schedule, with documentation. When he proposed, he actually had a list of reasons. I thought it was charming. Reason number 4, I remember, was you are sensible about money. And I look back at that list now the way you look back at a lease you signed without reading, except I did read. That's the whole story. Really, so hold on to it. I have always read. The prenup came 3 months before the wedding. Frank sat me down, kitchen table, laminated tabs, the whole ceremony, and explained that his father had been taken apart in a divorce, that his pension was going to be substantial someday, and that smart couples protect themselves going in. His lawyer had drafted it, his terms. I was a 25-year-old assistant librarian making $11,000 a year. My entire net worth was a Honda Civic and a set of encyclopedias. My mother told me to be insulted. My sister Diane, you'll meet Diane properly later, she's the best person in this story, told me to run. But I loved him, and honestly, the document didn't ask anything of me that I had. So one evening while Frank watched television, I sat at that kitchen table and I read the whole thing, every page. It's what librarians do, we don't skim. And on page 6 in the boilerplate Frank's lawyer had copied from some template was a clause, mutual, standard, unremarkable in 1991, stating that each party's separate property, including any inheritances or assets derived from them, would remain that party's sole and separate property forever, untouchable by the other, no matter what. I remember reading it twice. I remember thinking, well, that's fair. It protects his pension and it protects my nothing. And I remember Frank, when I brought the signed pages back, flipping straight to the signature line without glancing at the rest, because in Frank's mind there was only one asset in that marriage worth protecting, and it was his. He initialed each page in his block print, FD, FD, FD. Like a man stamping widgets. He initialed page 6. He never read page 6. I know that for a fact, and you'll know it too before this story is done. Now let me tell you what 35 years with Frank Delaney was actually like. Because the Thanksgiving mistress didn't come out of nowhere. She came out of a marriage with a caste system. In our house, there was the real money, and there was Barb's money. The real money was Frank's salary, Frank's pension, Frank's investment account that he reviewed nightly like a farmer checking weather. Barb's money was my librarian's paycheck, which went to groceries and the kids' shoes, and it was spoken of always, with a small smile. When I got a raise, Frank would say, every little bit helps. Little. That word did 40 years of work in my marriage. My job was your little job. My book club was your little club. My sister's family, 2 hours away, was not worth the gas. Barb, they're your people you visit. And I did visit, alone, for 35 years, which turned out to matter more than anything else in this story, because my people included my father. Walter Kowalski, machinist, 40 years in a tool and die shop. A quiet Polish immigrant's son with grease in the creases of his hands, and a mind that never stopped solving. My father held 11 patents. Most of them were small. Fixture designs, a clamping mechanism, the kind of thing that earns a plaque and a handshake. But 2 of them, filed in the late 80s, covered a self-centering coupling design that turned out to be useful in ways even Dad didn't fully predict. Frank met my father maybe a dozen times in 35 years, and his verdict, delivered in the car after the first visit, was, nice enough, simple people. My father, who could visualize tolerances in thousandths of an inch, was simple people. Frank never asked him a single question about his work. Not one in 3 decades. Remember that, in 2003, a mid-sized manufacturer, licensed my father's 2 coupling patents for use in a line of industrial equipment. Dad called me, not the family broadly, because I was the one who visited, and he was giggling like a boy. Bezia, he said, that's what he called me. Bruh. They're going to pay me for thinking. The licensing deal paid royalties on units sold. It started modest. My father bought a new recliner and a snowblower and considered himself a king. When I mentioned it at home, and I did mention it, I want that on the record, Frank looked up from his ledger and said, good for him. Tell him not to blow it, and went back to the real money. That was the entire conversation. That was the only conversation. My father died in 2009. I sat with him at the end. Frank came to the funeral and checked his watch during the eulogy. My eulogy. Dad's estate split 3 ways between me, my sister Diane, and my brother Tom. The house, some savings, and the patent royalty rights, 1/3 each. When the estate settled, I told Frank about my share. I want to be completely honest with you about how that conversation went, because people always ask if I hid it, and the answer is no, I hid nothing. I sat at the kitchen table and said, Frank, Dad's estate came through. There's some money and my share of his patent royalties, flup. And Frank, this is word for word, it's carved into me, said, how much are we talking? And I said the savings portion is about 40,000, and he nodded and said, fine, keep your little inheritance separate, Barb. I don't want it complicating our position, you handle it. Keep it separate, you handle it. He never asked about the royalties. Not what they paid, not how long they ran, not what the patents even were. The word royalties went past him the way my whole family always went past him, simple people, small numbers, not worth the gas, feel. So I did exactly what my husband instructed. I kept it separate. I opened an account at a different bank, my bank downtown, next to the library, and the royalties went there. And here's where I need you to understand something about the years 2009 to now. Because this is the engine of the whole story. That equipment line the manufacturer built on Dad's couplings, it grew. In 2012 they expanded it into a second product family. In 2016 a bigger company acquired them and pushed the products into international markets, and the licensing agreement, which my father's small-town attorney had, God bless him, written with a fixed royalty per unit and no cap, rode along. The checks that had bought Dad a snowblower became checks that made me sit down in my kitchen. Quarterly deposits that started in the hundreds became thousands, then tens of thousands. And I, a librarian who had spent 31 years around reference materials, did what I do. I read. I read about index funds. I read about compounding. I read 3 books on investment fundamentals, and then I hired a fee-only advisor named Patricia at the downtown bank. A woman with sensible shoes and no cologne of salesmanship on her. And every quarter, the royalties landed and got invested, and the account did the thing that money does when a careful person leaves it alone for 16 years. Did I know I should tell him? People ask me that, and I've turned it over many nights. So here's my honest answer. At first, there was nothing dramatic to tell. It was Barb's little inheritance, exactly as assigned. By the time it was something, telling Frank had become a decision, and every year handed me a new reason to decide not to. The year he made me return a coat because we're not coat people, Barb, fee. The year our daughter Emily needed a semester abroad fee, and Frank ran the numbers out loud for a week about whether Europe was structurally necessary. While I could have paid it from 1/4 royalties, and I did pay half quietly, telling him the school had a grant. The year of my 60th birthday, when he gave me a card and a spiral-bound book of coupons for local restaurants, and told our son Michael in front of me, your mother's easy to shop for. She's never needed much. There it is again. Never needed much. Flee. A man builds a sentence like that and lives inside it for 35 years, and eventually his wife stops correcting the record and starts keeping her own. I'm not proud of the silence. I want to say that plainly, because this is a confession, and confessions that skip the confessor's sins are just advertisements. I let my marriage become 2 sealed rooms, and I told myself it was his fault for never knocking. It was his fault for never knocking. But I also greased the hinges. Both things are true now. The third act, frame as Frank would come to call it. It started 14 months ago with consulting trips. Frank had retired from the firm at 63 Fleck with the pension he'd guarded like a reliquary, about $7,000 a month, plus his investment account, plus the house, solid but not spectacular, which I only knew because of the annual reviews. Retirement made Frank strange. He bought a convertible, used after 9 weeks of research, and then seemed angry that it didn't change anything. And then the firm asked him back for occasional consulting, and suddenly Frank, who had begrudged my sister 2 hours of gas money for 3 decades, was driving to site visits that required overnights. He came back from the first one with a new belt. I noticed because in 35 years Frank had bought belts the way nations ratify treaties, rarely and with ceremony. Then came a phone he angled away from me, and cologne, actual cologne, from a man who considered scented soap an extravagance. And I did the math. I always do the math, and the math said what it said, and I found that what I felt was not what I expected to feel. I expected a knife. What I got was a kind of terrible quiet, like walking into the library after closing. I think, and this is hard to say, that some part of me had already checked out of the marriage years before, and had simply been waiting, with a librarian's patience, to see if he'd ever come looking for me. He never did. He went looking somewhere else. Her name I'd learn was Cheryl. She was 51, worked in the front office of a vendor Frank consulted for, and I'll let one detail do all the work here. Her social media, which my sister Diane located in 9 minutes, was full of lake houses. Photos of lake houses. Captions like manifesting this life, and third acts are for living. Somewhere in those overnights, my husband, the foil reuser, had evidently been telling this woman a story about his position. And she had evidently been believing it. I found out for certain in September. A hotel folio in his blazer pocket, dinner for two, and I stood in my closet holding it and felt the last little tether snap, not with a sound but with a kind of relief. And here is where I made the decision that this whole story hangs on. I didn't confront him. I called Patricia at the bank instead, and then I called an attorney Patricia recommended, a family lawyer named Susan Ott with a handshake like a door closing, and I sat in her office and put 3 things on her desk. The hotel folio, my account statements and a photocopy, kept for 35 years in my father's old accordion file, of a prenuptial agreement dated 1991. Susan read the folio and nodded. She read the statements and her eyebrows went up. Then she read page 6 of the prenup, and this woman, an attorney of 20-some years, actually laughed one short laugh and covered her mouth and said, "Mrs. Delaney, who drafted this?" And I said, "His lawyer. His terms," he insisted. And Susan set the pages down flat, smoothed them with her palm like something precious and said, "Then whatever happens next, you let him lead. Don't file first. Don't tip anything. A man who wrote his own trap will walk into it with much more confidence than one who suspects a trap exists." So I went home, and I put dinner on the table, and I waited for my husband to lead. He led at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone. Because Frank, it turns out, had done his own consulting with a lawyer, and had come away, I'd learn this later, with the happy confirmation that his 1991 prenup fully protected the pension, which was the only sentence he'd listened to, because it was the only asset he could imagine mattering. And a man who believes he is fully protected stops bothering to hide. Let me set the table for you. Thanksgiving, our house, the long oak table Frank's mother left us. Present, our son Michael, 32, an accountant, with his wife Grace. Our daughter Emily, 29, a nurse, flown in from Denver. My sister Diane and her husband Ed, invited by me, that year of all years, on instinct. Me in the kitchen since 6 a.m., and 2 empty chairs, one for Frank, who was picking something up, and one at my right hand that had been my mother's chair at every holiday until she passed, and had stayed hers, by unspoken family law ever since. Nobody sat in Helen's chair. The grandchildren knew it before they could read. Frank arrived at 4:15, and he was not alone. He walked into that dining room with a woman in a white coat and lakehouse hair, holding a bottle of wine that I promise you she bought. And the room did that thing where every conversation stops mid-syllable. And Frank, I have to hand it to him, the man had rehearsed, put his hand on the small of her back and said, "Everyone, this is Cheryl. Cheryl, everyone. Sit here, honey." And he pulled out my mother's chair. She sat in Helen's chair. She put her napkin in her lap and complimented the centerpiece. Michael said, "Dad, what is this?" Not a question. Grace had gone rigid. Emily was looking at me. They were all looking at me, I realized, waiting to see if I knew. If this was somehow arranged, if the world still made sense. And Frank clinked his knife against his glass, standing at the head of the table over a turkey I had basted for 5 hours, and gave the toast he must have been polishing in the convertible for weeks. Family. I'm 63 years old. I've spent my whole life being responsible, for this firm, for this house, for everyone at this table, and I've realized something this year. Life gives you a third act, and you either take it or you die at your desk with a full pension and an empty tank. He actually said empty tank. Cheryl nodded along like a backup singer. "So I'm going to say this plainly because you all deserve plainness. Barbara and I are divorcing. It'll be simple. We have a prenuptial agreement. Ironclad, my pension is protected. Everything's orderly. No lawyers dragging things out, no drama. Cheryl and I are starting fresh." And then he turned to me, in front of my children, in front of my sister, in front of the woman in my mother's chair, and he did the thing. He reached over and patted the back of my hand twice, the way you'd pat a well-behaved animal, and delivered it. "You'll be fine, Barb. A little apartment, your books. You never needed much." I want to describe the next 10 seconds precisely, because everyone at that table experienced them differently, and I've collected all their accounts since. Michael stood up so fast his chair barked against the floor and said, "Are you out of your mind?" Grace grabbed his wrist. Emily made a sound I hadn't heard since she was a child. A single cracked dad. Diane, my sister, went the other direction entirely. She went still and she looked not at Frank but at me, because Diane is the only person on earth who knew about the account, and I watched my sister understand, in real time, what Thanksgiving had just become. Ed studied the turkey. Cheryl, God love her, reached for the stuffing, because in whatever story she'd been told, this was the hard part being handled well, and I looked at my husband of 35 years, at his confident chin, at his blockprint certainty, at a man so sure of a document he'd never read, that he'd staked his third act on it in front of witnesses, and I felt the strangest thing. Not the knife, not even the quiet. What I felt was the feeling I used to get at the library, when a patron would stand at my desk insisting loudly that a book didn't exist, while I could see it on the shelf behind them. That specific private, professional calm. So I said, Frank. The table froze. 35 years of marriage and every person there braced for the scream I had certainly earned. I picked up my fork and I said, could you pass the cranberry sauce? He blinked. He passed it. I put cranberry sauce on my plate and took a bite of the turkey I'd made. And it was, honestly, a very good turkey. Michael sat down slowly like a man lowering himself into cold water. Emily started to cry without sound. Flay and Frank. This is the part I'll savor until they close the lid. Frank relaxed. He read my calm as surrender. He turned to Cheryl and gave her a little nod. See, I told you she'd be reasonable, and started carving second portions. And spent the rest of that meal narrating his third act. The travel, the simplifying, the timeline. While his abandoned wife ate quietly at the other end of the table. Doing something none of them could see. I was doing the math. His math, this time. $7,000 a month pension, the house split or bought out. His investment account. And page 6. Sitting in my father's accordion file like a book on a shelf behind a shouting patron. And somewhere between the turkey and the pie that nobody touched, I made my last decision of that terrible dinner. I would not say one word before the paperwork did. Susan's voice, let him lead. He had led. Now the documents would follow in their own time, in a conference room, with disclosures exchanged under oath, in front of our children if they insisted on coming, and they would insist. Frank wanted plainness. Frank was going to get plainness at a level of detail he could not currently imagine. Dinner ended the way car accidents end, with everyone standing around the wreck not knowing what to hold. Cheryl thanked me, for such a lovely meal, and I said, you're very welcome, and Diane made a noise into her wine. Michael cornered his father in the driveway. I watched through the window, my son's hands moving, my husband's arms folded, patient, untouchable. Emily hugged me in the kitchen so hard my ribs creaked and whispered, Mom, we will fight this. Grace's cousin is a lawyer, the prenup can't just. And I held my daughter's face in my hands, this nurse, this good heart, and I came so close. The sentence was right there, honey. The prenup is the best thing that ever happened to me. But Susan's rule held. And there was a mistress in my dining room within earshot, so instead I said, Emily, I promise you I will be fine. I need you to trust that your mother has read everything she has ever signed. Emily looked at me strangely. She told me later something in my voice was wrong, but the good wrong, and let it go. Frank moved out that weekend to Cheryl's townhouse, taking his ledgers, his convertible, and his certainty. He texted the family group chat. The man announced his own departure with a text, this will be an amicable and efficient process. The paperwork is straightforward. Everyone stay calm. Everyone stay calm. The petition arrived the first week of December, exactly as advertised. Clean, efficient, citing the prenuptial agreement of 1991, proposing that each party retain their separate property per its terms, pension to him, and offering me, I'm quoting the proposal, a transitional sum sufficient for modest rehousing, a little apartment, in writing. Susan called me when it came in and I could hear the smile in her voice. She said, Mrs. Delaney, he's asking the court to enforce the prenup, fully, as written. I asked what happened next. She said the next step was mediation, both parties, both attorneys, and the mandatory exchange of complete financial disclosures. Every account, every asset. Sworn mediation was set for the second week of January, 6 weeks after the turkey. Michael and Emily both announced they were coming. Adult children can attend if the parties allow it, and Frank, magnanimous in victory, said the more the merrier, let them see it done properly. And so, on a gray Tuesday morning, in a law office conference room with bad coffee and a long table, I sat down across from my almost ex-husband, who winked, at our son, while the attorneys opened their folders to exchange the sworn financial disclosures, and Frank's lawyer picked up my asset schedule and began, for the first time in this entire story, to actually read. I watched his eyes reach the middle of the page. I watched them stop, okay. This is the part everyone's been waiting for, and I'm going to slow it down the way it deserves. Because I have replayed those 4 minutes in that conference room more times than I've read any book in my life. And I was a librarian for 31 years. Picture the table. Long, walnut, too shiny. Frank's side. Frank in his good gray blazer, and his attorney, a brisk man named Halloran, who had clearly been told this was a formality. My side. Me and Susan Ott, who had spent 6 weeks preparing for this morning with the contained joy of a woman icing a cake in secret. At the end of the table, in chairs against the wall, Michael and Emily, our children, invited by their father to watch things done properly. The mediator, a retired judge with reading glasses on a chain, handled the folders. Complete sworn financial disclosures exchanged simultaneously. Frank slid his across, with the little exhale of a man revealing a hand he knows is winning. Pension valuation, investment account, his half of the house equity, solid, orderly, real money. And Halloran picked up mine. I want to describe exactly what a man's face does when a formality stops being one. Halloran was skimming. You could see the skim, the professional glide. House interest, retirement account from the school district, modest, and then his eyes hit the middle of the page and the glide stopped. His chin came down maybe half an inch. He read the line again. Then he did the thing I'll never forget. He turned the page over, looked at the back, as if the explanation might be printed there, turned it back, and read it a third time. Then he said, to the mediator in a voice that had lost its briskness entirely, "Could we? I'd like to request a brief recess." Frank, who had been leaning back, said, "Why? What is it?" And when his own lawyer didn't immediately answer, my husband of 35 years reached over and took the paper out of Halloran's hands. The room was silent, truly silent. The mediator's pen stopped, the ventilation hummed, and I watched Frank Delaney read. Item 4. Investment account, First Community Bank downtown. Source of funds. Inherited patent royalty income, separate property, received quarterly since 2009, originating from licensing agreement dated 2003, estate of Walter Kowalski. Current value, $4.2 million. Frank read it the way he did everything, methodically, in order, and I got to watch the sequence land in his engineering brain one gear at a time. Confusion first, a flat frown, an error on a blueprint. Then verification, his eyes jumped to the account number, the bank name, the sworn signature, mine, at the bottom. Then the arithmetic. And Frank was always fast at arithmetic. 2003, 2009, 16 years, quarterly, compounding. And then, last, the arrival, the moment the whole schematic resolved, and my husband's face did something I had never once seen it do in 3.5 decades. It went soft, slack, full, the certainty. The load-bearing certainty that had held that face together since 1991, drained out of it all at once, and for 1 second I saw the 26-year-old from the church potluck. Lost, he said. "This is Barbara, what is this?" And I said, mild level, the voice I used for patrons who insisted the book didn't exist. "That's my little inheritance, Frank. You told me to keep it separate. I keep everything I'm told to keep." Halloran, to his credit, was already doing his job. He asked quietly, urgently, for the recess again, and I watched him lean toward Frank and whisper, and I didn't need to hear it because I knew the words he was saying. Separate property. But Frank waved him off, waved off his own lawyer, in front of the mediator, because Frank had never once in his life believed that anyone in a room understood a situation better than he did. He said loudly, no recess. Hold on, this is marital. 35 years, everything's on the table, that's how it works. We'll be adjusting the proposals. Obviously. This changes the whole. And Susan Ott, my attorney, who had been waiting 6 weeks for this exact sentence, opened her folder without hurry, removed a photocopied document, and slid it down the walnut table like a librarian returning a book to the one patron who needed it most. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "I direct you to the prenuptial agreement executed March of 1991. You'll find it's already on the table, your side filed it. Your petition asks the court to enforce it fully, as written. Page 6, paragraph 3, each party's separate property, expressly including inheritances and any assets derived therefrom, remains that party's sole and separate property, unreachable by the other, regardless of the length of the marriage." She paused, and delivered the close with the gentleness of a scalpel. The paragraph is initialed. F.D. Your client's hand, I believe. His lawyer drafted it, his terms. We're simply agreeing to them. Frank grabbed the photocopy. He flipped to page 6, and there they were, his initials, his block print, F.D., stamped beside the clause in 1991 by a man protecting the only asset he could imagine mattering. A man so busy guarding his pension that he'd never noticed the door swung both ways. He stared at his own initials for a long time. Then he looked up, and he found me at the other end of the table, and he asked the only honest question he'd asked me in years. He said, "You read it, in 1991. You read the whole thing, it wasn't an accusation, it was worse, it was comprehension." And I said, "Frank, I have read everything I have ever signed. You married me for it. Reason number 4 on your list, sensible about money. I've been sensible for 35 years. Today's just the annual review." And then I said the rest, because our children were in the room, and they deserved the whole ledger spoken aloud. "Your prenup, Frank. Your lawyer, your clause, your initials. Separate stays separate, you insisted. And you were right to. So here's the math. The pension is all yours, every dollar, exactly as you designed. So is Cheryl." I folded my hands. "So is the math. Emily made a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh and clapped her hand over her mouth. Michael, my accountant son, who had spent 6 weeks quietly grieving what he assumed was his mother's financial ruin, leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling and whispered, 4.2. The mediator, the retired judge, took off his reading glasses, polished them, put them back on, reread page 6, flee, and said, with the weariness of a man who has seen everything except this, counsel, I don't often say this, but I don't anticipate this mediation requiring a second session. It didn't. Prop. Here's how fast a divorce moves when one side wrote the terms of his own destruction and filed a petition demanding they be enforced. Halloran and took his recess after all. 20 minutes in the hallway with Frank, and through the glass we could all see the shape of it, for a Halloran talking with his hands low and calm, Frank shaking his head, then shaking it slower, then not shaking it at all. They came back in and Halloran said his client wished to revisit the framework, and Susan said the framework was Frank's own filing and we'd be proceeding on it, and the mediator agreed. Because there was nothing to disagree with. Every term Frank had proposed in December got enforced in January to the letter. He kept his pension, $7,000 a month, untouchable, exactly as guarded. He kept his investment account. The house was sold and split per the agreement. And I kept per page 6, paragraph 3 the, initialed FD, every dollar of my father's thinking. The whole thing was signed and done in 9 weeks, which Frank had promised everyone would be the case, amicable and efficient. Phew. The man was finally right about something, but the collapse, the real collapse, happened outside the paperwork, and it happened in exactly the order I could have predicted if I'd let myself. Cheryl lasted until Easter. I want to be measured about Cheryl, Rue, because she was lied to as thoroughly as anyone in this story, just in the other direction. Somewhere in those consulting overnights, Frank had let a story grow about his position. Early retirement, freedom, a lake house on the horizon, manifesting this life, for all. What the divorce revealed to Cheryl in cruel fast sequence was the actual position. A 63-year-old man with a fixed pension, half the proceeds of a modest house, and a court record showing that the fortune in the marriage had been sitting, the entire time, on the side of the table he'd patted like a dog. My sister Diane, who monitors these things the way Frank monitored money, reported the updates. The lake house photos stopped in February. In March, a post about protecting your peace from people who misrepresent themselves. By Easter, Cheryl was gone. And Frank was in a one-bedroom condo across from a shopping plaza. And I want to be precise here because precision is the whole point. It was a perfectly fine condo, modest. A little apartment, if you will. He never needed much. The regret parade began in April. And it arrived exactly the way Frank does everything. Late, methodical, and in writing. First came the children's accounts of him, because Frank started calling Michael weekly. Michael, the accountant, whom Frank had apparently decided was the son most likely to appreciate a numerical injustice. Except Michael had been in the room. Michael had watched his father seat a stranger in his grandmother's chair and prescribe his mother a little apartment. And my son. I raised him, but he still surprised me. Told his father on one of those calls, the sentence that got repeated at every family gathering since. Dad, you're not mad she hid it. You're mad she read it. Those are different sins, and only one of them is hers. Frank stopped calling Michael after that. Then came the letter. I knew it was coming the way you know weather. It arrived in May, a single page, engineer's block print, every letter vertical and even. And I'm going to share the sentence at the heart of it because it deserves preservation in a museum. Barbara. I have had time to reflect, and I believe we moved too quickly. Given new information, I think it would be worth reconsidering the dissolution. We were always a good team where it counted. Frank. Given new information. 35 years of marriage, one mistress in my mother's chair. And the man's overture was drafted like a change order on a construction project. He didn't apologize. I want this noted. There is no apology anywhere on that page, not the word sorry, not its cousins. There is only the acknowledgement that the numbers had changed and therefore, logically, so should the arrangement. I read it once, standing at my kitchen counter. Then I did something I'd been saving. I took it to the frame shop downtown, the nice one, next to my bank, and I had them mat it in cream and frame it in thin black metal, just the phrase visible through the window mat. Given new information. It hangs in my hallway now. Guests ask about it. I tell them it's the most honest things Ekka's husband ever wrote me. He tried twice more. A phone call in June that I let go to voicemail, in which he suggested, coffee, as adults, no agendas. And observed that Cheryl had never been serious. You understand, it was a symptom of something we could have fixed, a symptom. She sat in Helen's chair, Frank. And then in August, the last one, he showed up. My porch, a Sunday holding, of all objects on this earth, my spiral-bound coupon book for my 60th birthday, which he'd found packing the house, offered back to me now like a relic proving we'd had good times. He stood on my steps and said, I keep thinking about what went wrong. And I looked at this man I had loved at 24 and buried my father beside and raised 2 children with, and I felt, I'll be honest. One clean ache, like a bell struck once. And then I said, Frank, nothing went wrong. Everything went exactly according to the documents. You of all people should find that comforting. And I closed the door. Not hard. Firmly. The way you close a reference book when the question's been answered. Now the accounting of everyone else, because a regret parade has more than one float. Frank's brother Dennis. For 35 years, Dennis was the amen corner, for every Barb doesn't need much joke, at barbecues, at Christmases, once memorably at my own 25th anniversary party, where the brothers toasted Frank for finding a low-maintenance model. Dennis called me in the spring, after the numbers had made their way through the family the way numbers do, and I braced for the ask, because by then everyone who called had an ask. But Dennis didn't ask. Dennis said, and his voice was gravel, Barbara, I laughed at every one of those jokes for 35 years. 35 years of telling a woman she doesn't need much, is just a family agreeing to underpay her. I helped agree. I'm ashamed of it, and I'd have said this, even if your father's patents had bought him nothing but the snowblower. And then, because Dennis is a Delaney, and Delaneys can't leave an emotion unaccompanied by a task, he said, your gutters, Frank always did them badly anyway, I'll be there in October. He's been there every October since. He brings his own ladder and refuses lunch twice before accepting it. That's the genuine one. Every story has exactly one, and you don't get to choose who it is. Frank himself today. The condo by the plaza, the pension arriving on the first of the month exactly as designed, the convertible sold. Diane's intelligence network reports he cited practicality. He does his own annual review now, I assume, at a smaller kitchen table, and I've been told by Michael that he has taken up model trains, which requires precision and patience and control of a small world, and honestly, sincerely, I hope it gives him peace. The children see him, birthdays, an occasional lunch, because I never asked them not to, and their sentence about those visits, Emily's phrasing is, he's smaller now, not sad exactly, corrected. The holidays, though, are mine, and not by decree. Nobody voted. Thanksgiving arrived last year and everyone drove to my place, and my mother's chair sat at my right hand, empty until Diane sat in it, which is the only exception Helen's law was ever going to allow and me. You want to know what I did, so here's the ending. And I built it deliberately, every board of it. I bought the little apartment. I need you to hear that correctly. I bought the little apartment Frank prescribed. Downtown 4 blocks from my old library, above an independent bookstore called the Marginalia. A penthouse unit, top floor, 2 bedrooms and a wall of southern light. And I paid for it in cash, in full, with a cashier's check drawn on the account at First Community Bank, RUP. And the young man handling the closing looked at the check, and then at the retired librarian across the table, and visibly recalculated something about the world. The apartment has floor-to-ceiling shelves that I paid a carpenter to build correctly, with adjustable pins, because I have opinions. It has my reading chair by the south window. And above the reading chair, in the place of honor, hangs a framed drawing. My father's original patent illustration for the self-centering coupling. Figure 1, all his careful lines and reference numbers, full. Walter Kowalski, printed in the corner in draftsman's lettering not so different, if I'm honest, from Frank's block print. Except my father used his careful hands to build things for people, and spent his royalties on a recliner, and called me Bossia, and thought getting paid for thinking was the funniest miracle of his life. I sit under that drawing most evenings. Quarterly, the royalty checks still arrive. The patents have a few years left on them, and quarterly, I do my own annual review. No laminated tabs, a cup of tea, and Patricia on the phone for 20 minutes. I fund a scholarship now at the Technical College machining program, 1 student a year, full ride, named for my father. The first recipient sent me a thank you card and misspelled Kowalski and I cried anyway. Emily flies in more than she used to. Michael and Grace come for Sunday dinners and Michael always checks the frame in the hallway on his way in, given new information, and taps the glass twice, like a little salute. And sometimes on a good evening, full year, with the bookstore lights glowing up through my windows and $4.2 million of my father's thinking, sitting quietly in the bank, where my husband never once thought to look. I say the sentence out loud to the empty, sufficient, entirely mine apartment, fear, just to hear how true it turned out to be. I never needed much. I just read everything, so tell me honestly because my children still argue about it at my table. 35 years, and I never once told him what the little inheritance became. He never asked, but I also stopped offering. VA. Was my silence its own kind of betrayal that I got lucky with? Or does a man who writes the contract, mocks your family for decades, seats his mistress in your mother's chair, and prescribes you a little apartment, deserve to learn about page 6 exactly the way Frank did, under oath, pray in front of his children, from a document with his own initials on it? And the letter, given new information, be honest with me, would you have framed it too?